Hello and welcome back to Give the People What They Want. I'm Zoe Alexandra from People's Dispatch, joined by Roger McKenzie from Morning Star and Prasanth, an Indian journalist. We have a lot to take you through today. Of course, many explosive global events in the past couple of days, in the past 24 hours. We'll get to all of that and more.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup.
Well, yesterday, earlier this morning, there was news that India had hit targets in Pakistan as part of its retaliation for the Pahalgam attacks. Prasanth, take us through what's happened. Are we close to war? What is the situation right now?
Right, Zoe, very difficult to comment right now because we often talk about developing situations. This is the epitome of one. Very difficult to say what is going to happen in the next few hours as well. So many things up in the air, but I'll just start with the facts first. Like you said, just about less than 24 hours ago, India struck 9 places in Kashmir and Pakistan, and the terminology used, I'll specifically quote it because we'll come back to that later. And what the Indian security forces described as focused, measured, and non-escalatory strikes. Now, there are some conflicting reports on the casualties. Pakistani media and international media have reported that civilians were also killed in these attacks. The Indian establishment sources have said that they targeted only, what is called terrorist infrastructure. So we're still waiting for some more reports on that. But nonetheless, like you said, this is a big, a huge moment, so to speak, on the back of already what has been developing. And like you said, it's a response to the terror attack in Pahalgam, which took place on April 22nd. 26 civilians were killed there. And ever since, tensions have been very high in the entire region. We have seen, talk of retaliatory measures. India has walked out of the Indus Waters Treaty, which is likely to have a very bad impact on Pakistani farmers, especially. The impact of that we might see only much later, much down the line, and that's quite dangerous as well. There's been a lot of firing from both sides of the border. Again, civilian lives once again getting affected. And what we're also seeing is basically that we really at this point don't know what the Pakistani response will be. Will there be a response? What will it be? There is talk of some analysts have said that this moment might actually be a space for what is called de-escalation, but really remains to be seen. So, right now, a lot of it very difficult to predict at this point, and I'm not even going to attempt it. I think what I'll just limit myself to is maybe some comments on what are the challenges before people's movements at this point of time, before activists. And I think one of the key things is, to start with, what is something we've talked about often on this show, which might almost seem a bit trite, but which is actually not, which is that nobody really wants a war. Nobody wants war. That's a qualified statement, but we'll come to that. But the more important thing, obviously, war is not a solution to any of the issues we're talking about, especially terrorism, for that matter, any of the issues that people are facing at this point. And unfortunately, over the past few weeks, what we've seen is that there have been voices on both sides of the border which have been, indulging in this jingoistic rhetoric, calling for war, calling for violence. And now it's very easy to do that in front of a camera. It's on the keyboard. But, it's the lives of millions of civilians which are at stake at this point, and that's highly irresponsible. So it's very important for people's movements, for peace movements at this point, to actually keep pushing that agenda across, that war is not something that will benefit anybody at all, and that has to be first and central. And also, I think that word escalation is very important because everyone says, like I said, both sides are talking about the fact they don't want to escalate. The international community saying that we don't want it to escalate, but this escalation is a very tricky word because it all boils down to a few individuals whose actions are unpredictable. Like a very senior colleague of mine likes to say that nobody wanted World War I to happen, but it happened nonetheless, right? So, how do you sort of manage what is this kind of an escalation? So again, very heavy responsibility for these movements to watch out for, to push their agenda. And also, I think, again, very important in terms of this moment not being used to further push sectarian and communal divides, which again has happened to polarize people further, again, to the benefit of sections in both countries. We have seen crackdowns on dissent. We have seen attempts to suppress free speech. All of that, again, very bad for this moment. So I think, for people's movements, it's very central to sort of push that agenda, combat jingoism, combat warmongering. There has to be, of course, justice for any and all civilians, innocent people who were killed. But at the same time, that cannot be. War is definitely not the solution. There is, of course, often the talk about diplomacy. Diplomatic channels must be explored. Again, important to note that diplomatic channels are not created in a day, right? So it requires a process. It's a question of how countries approach diplomacy. It's a much larger question. It can't, one day suddenly diplomacy can't happen. And I think it's a question to the establishments of both countries as to what can be done over there. So, and I think also the responsibility of people's movements to actually keep pushing that and make sure that that agenda stays very much central in how these conversations are framed, in what kind of actions are taken. So, like I said, very difficult times for people in the subcontinent right now, very challenging times. And I think the agenda of peace is still very, very important.
Thank you, Prasanth, for that sober analysis. I think that's a key element, and especially the role of media in not fanning the flames of war, but really providing accurate, fact-based updates without really kind of trying to drum the, towards the conflict. So unfortunately, we still have to keep going back to Gaza because the appetite for war in Israel appears to be insatiable. Roger, tell us the latest there.
Well, I think as Prasanth was saying earlier on, it's really difficult to keep up with kind of emerging kind of events. I mean, just today, we've had at least 57 Palestinians killed in an air attack on Gaza again by the Israelis. The Israelis have also attacked Lebanon. And all of this has come after Israel made it perfectly clear earlier on this week that their intention now is to occupy Gaza permanently. So they're openly saying to the world, we are going to break international law. They are saying that very openly, and there's hardly been a whimper of protests from many across the West, or at least the establishments across the West. There's clearly been opposition by activists, peace campaigners, still continuing to raise their voices and say something needs to happen over this, that this move needs to be halted. But of course, the main benefactor of Israel in all of this is the United States. There's no way Israel could do any of this without the support of the United States, and that needs to be made crystal clear. Now, of course, what also the announcement by Israel means is that it completely scuppers any real opportunity for ceasefire talks. In fact, hours after Israel made that announcement, Hamas made it clear that ceasefire talks were completely meaningless, and of course they're right. Why? How is there any kind of possibility of having a decent conversation, meaningful conversation about peace talks when the opposing side has already said that they are going to up their assaults, their devastation on not just buildings but on people? What we're seeing is the continued annihilation of men, women and children across Gaza. The Israelis have made it really clear with their actions in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Syria, which they continue to attack as well, that they are going full force for this greater Israel concept. This is a time for peace campaigners, I think. I think the tide is turning, where many more people who were skeptical at the beginning of this assault by Israel, I think many of the people who were saying that, yeah, Israel has a right to defend itself and all of that sort of stuff, are now seeing what the real agenda is, are seeing the behavior of Israeli troops, are seeing the behavior of the settlers, so-called settlers, across the region, and they're seeing that Israel simply wants to annihilate the Palestinians. What we've also heard today is that the US is saying that it is well, sources are claiming, put it that way, that discussions are taking place between the US and Israel for a US-led administration in Gaza. I've just come across that in the last hour or two. Now, if that's the case, this really underlines the point that President Trump was making some time ago, again illegally, that he wants to evict all the Palestinians and create this seafront Riviera type insulting nonsense. This is ethnic cleansing that's taking place, and that again is something the peace campaigners need to make it clear. And part of what I think we need to do is not just to continue to talk to each other about this, but to go out into those workplaces and communities that have not heard our message yet and have those one-to-one conversations with people so they can hear. And part of that is a big role, of course, for journalists in all of this, in terms of what we write and making sure that what we write doesn't just reach the usual kind of people who read what we write. We need to get this stuff out into a wider readership. So it's an important time, really, for the Palestinians more than anybody else. They continue to be under attack. The prospects for peace are as far away as they've ever been. And our role is to make sure that we build that people's movement for peace.
Yeah, it seems it's a dizzying time that just a couple months ago, there was this, exciting hope about a ceasefire agreement, the images of prisoners being released, and now it feels like we're back at square one, as you said, Roger. Another place where decades, and in this case centuries, of US and European imperialism has caused a situation which now the US says is out of control and out of our hands, is Haiti. This past week, several armed groups, gangs in Haiti were designated as foreign terrorist organizations, part of this push by the Trump administration to kind of use this war on terror rhetoric against gangs, and of course use it to some certain political advantages, of course trying to weaponize it to crack down on migrants, as we've seen that has happened and with Venezuelan migrants, with Salvadoran migrants, and now Haitian gangs have been added to this list. And it's interesting because in the language that the US State Department uses to describe this and to justify the designation is that the people who are working against peace for the Haitian people, that their impunity is over. And it's a really, for anyone who knows about Haitian history, this is sort of a slap in the face, given the role that the US has played in creating this crisis. A lot of people look at Haiti and they say, it's too complicated, there's so much violence, there's so much crisis, how could this have happened, what can be done now? And it is a very complex, devastating, and tragic and heartbreaking situation where civilians are being mass displaced, where they're being, assassinated, where there are massacres every day. But it is not a situation where there is not a clear root cause, where there aren't clear actors that actually helped create the situation. And at People's Dispatch, and of course, many left outlets for the past several decades have been pointing this out, a fact that's been made very clear by the people's movements in Haiti, that US and foreign intervention has created the current situation in Haiti, a situation where since Haiti became independent, they've had to pay this enormous colonial debt just for the crime of liberating their homeland and abolishing slavery. They have debt, and then repeated and constant US intervention, not only in terms of military occupation, but intervention in the political system, in propping up dictators, in excusing human rights violations of these same dictators, in not respecting the Haitian solutions to the situation, to the crisis. And now we have a situation where for the past 6 to 7 years, there have been no elected officials in the country. There's no legitimate democracy. And then people ask, why is it that gangs are taking over the country? Well, there's a protracted crisis that there's no possible democratic solution because all of these institutions have been hollowed out by neoliberal policies, have been hollowed out by these corrupt dictators that have been propped up by the US and the core group, which is made up, of course, of France and several other European nations. And now we're in the situation that we're in today, where peasants like Jean-Claude, who is someone who worked with the MST and Alba Movement's Internationalist Brigade, was just assassinated by a gang, a situation where doctors and teachers, are under threat. And so as we look at these conflicts across the world and say, how did they get, looking at Congo, looking at Sudan and say, how could it have gotten this bad? We have to remember the root causes of these. And I think that in that way that journalism is so important to always be bringing it back to this history, this very recent history in a lot of cases of the US interventions that destabilized the democratic system, of the debt, of these policies which have forced nations to hollow out their public sector. And this is happening in real time to a lot of other countries as well. So it's not just a historical lesson, it's a present lesson, and that we have to keep with us. So the situation in Haiti continues to deteriorate. Haitian movements are demanding that France repay the illegal debt that it imposed on the Haitian people, and that they be given the tools to actually restore democracy and create a transitional process towards rebuilding that democracy. So difficult moment, but the Haitian people continue to demand that they actually have the solutions to get out of the crisis. And in that way, we're going to now hop over to the UK. There were recent elections, very telling elections, revealed a lot about where the political situation is right now.
Well, we've got we had local elections in England and Wales last week, and this organisation called Reform UK made significant gains. Now, I deliberately call them an organisation rather than a party because they are not constituted as a normal political party. They're actually a business, which means that a business makes profits, and there's only one shareholder or director to that business, as I understand it, which is a guy called Nigel Farage, which many people would have heard of, who's a big supporter of US President Donald Trump. So what happened last week? Well, Reform UK won 677 seats out of the something like 1,600 seats that they competed in. Now, that's a huge proportion of seats to win. Admittedly, it's quite a small proportion of the overall seats that are available across local government in Britain, but nevertheless, for them to come from essentially nowhere to in local government to win that many seats is huge. They won 8 local authorities where they became absolutely in control of those local authorities. They were mainly Conservative Party held, in fact, entirely Conservative Party held councils. So that's a huge blow for the Conservative Party in particular, where they've been really kind of pressured from the right by Reform UK, and avowedly, anti-immigrants, extremely right-wing organisation. Some of the comments that some of these folks make are, just out of the pale, really, just considerably, just far right comments, essentially. They also won a parliamentary by-election. It's a seat called Runcorn and Helsby. They only won it by 6 votes, but they overturned a Labour majority of 9,000 votes So usually you'd think if you got a 9,000 majority, even in a by-election, you'd kind of hope to hold on to a seat like that. Well, Labour lost. Reform UK now have 5 members of parliament. So how did this happen? Well, essentially, Labour, which has been in power for less than a year, has demonstrated is now extremely unpopular, and it's extremely unpopular because it's demonstrated really that it is not a party that is concerned about giving support to the most vulnerable in society. So there's something, for example, it's attacked with its policies disable people. It's attacked policies aimed to help people the most vulnerable in society, or others who are also vulnerable in society. So there was a policy called the winter fuel allowance, which was there to help people to be able to pay their fuel bills. And fuel bills are rising massively across Britain. Well, they just simply stopped that. What did they do with that money? Well, they put it into the military. And people can see this sort of stuff, and so Labour's popularity came to power with a huge majority last year, has dwindled away. Reform is way ahead. I think it's really important that we don't see this as just being about what happens in Britain. Because what I think, need to see this as is part of a trend that's taking place where there's massive discontent with establishment parties across Britain, certainly, but also across the rest of the Europe. On Sunday, we saw Romania, the first round of the presidential elections in Romania, where a far-right candidate came top, for high 40%, just short of being able to win on the first round. So there'll be in 2 weeks' time there'll be another election for that. We see polls that show massive support for the AfD in Germany. We've just seen the election of the new chancellor in Germany, even though he was humiliated in a first round vote, but managed to get it on a second round vote. We see the sort of support that the right wing, the far right, are getting in Germany. Le Pen's party, even with her trials and tribulations for her personally, but her party still maintains huge support. And we're seeing this across the rest of Europe as well. So I think these are challenging times for the left. It's certainly a time when the establishment parties, which are the Social Democratic or Christian Union or whatever, are faced with choices to make about the directions that they want to go in. They seem to want to move further to the right, rather than to say, "Oh, well, we'll have policies that are going to support working class people," and so on. And that's their undoing. Why would you vote for a party that's a pale imitation of a far right party when you can vote for a far right party? And that seems to be what is happening. So these are extremely challenging times, not just in Britain, but I think across Europe as a whole, where the far right seems to be in ascendancy in electoral terms. So at a time we'll discuss shortly, at a time when we years ago fought off the far right, now many on the far right are being elected. In fact, many of them already in government, as we see in Italy. So challenging times again, and our job again is to continue to tell the story of why these far right politicians are winning, and they're winning because the establishment parties are not doing the job of standing up for working class people.
Well, definitely concerning developments in Europe and in the UK, but we didn't want to end on such a bit of a depressing note with war, with the rise of the far right. And so our last two stories are ones that hopefully can inspire hope and remind us of what it means to be in struggle. So in Panama for the last week and now week and a half, tens of thousands of workers have actually been on an indefinite national strike. Very impressive because these workers are not only striking on a purely economic basis. In fact, they're striking to demand the repeal of a law that would privatize their Social Security, which essentially would, of course, benefit big corporations and be deeply disadvantageous for working people, take away their pensions. We've seen this playbook of privatization of pensions. They're demanding the repeal of that. They're also demanding that a massive open pit mine, a copper mine of a Canadian company, not be reopened. And finally, this is actually an anti-imperialist, pro-sovereignty strike, which I think is one of the most remarkable aspects. We heard Trump during his campaign, and of course, once he was sworn in, going off about how the U.S. was going to take back the Panama Canal, that it was just merely that China had been given too many privileges, and really it was the U.S. who deserves this canal. And he's talking about Panama as if it's a place that the U.S. can just waltz into and take back a canal, which is of course ridiculous. And I think what's really incredible about this moment is that the Panamanian people are saying, our president may give you concessions, may say that you can open a military base in the south of Panama to detain migrants, to run its different operations like it does so many times in history from Central America. They're saying, we won't allow this, and we also will not allow you to touch our national sovereignty. So this is a really incredible moment. We saw images on the screen of the students and educators strike, which took place yesterday. Again, massive mobilization of an anti-imperialist character, of a pro-sovereignty character. And I think this is one of those struggles which really inspires. And it says, Donald Trump is walking around the world saying that he can do whatever he wants, that the U.S. is all powerful, can impose tariffs, can demand land, can get critical minerals wherever it wants. And actually, the people of this small nation in Central America and Panama are standing up and saying, hands off our Social Security and hands off our sovereignty. Really incredible. I recommend you check out the articles we have on People's Dispatch, the videos. I promise that it will give you hope and it will bring a smile to your face at the very least. So Prasanth, give us another dose of hope with these 80th anniversary of Victory Day.
Right, Victory Day marking the surrender of the Nazis, of course. Very important on this day to remember some countries, some people whose names are not going to be part of that celebration. I think 27 million people in the Soviet Union, close to around 20 million people in China. Even a country like India, which was under British rule, I think, some 85,000 Indian soldiers died, and more importantly, over 3 million people killed in a famine in Bengal at that time. West Bengal, and the whole of India were under British rule, and the lack of enough aid at that time is believed to have led to that famine. So the millions who died, there are a lot of millions, and many parts of Asia too, actually, who actually suffered, who died during that war. Their names often not mentioned, and that's actually kind of deliberate, because I think the Western countries in the West, especially the US and the UK, would like to sort of paint this victory over Germany and Italy as something that the liberal democratic order achieved in 1945 on its own. It was a victory of capitalism, is how they like to paint it. But the truth really is that it was a victory of the millions of working people across the world, and that's how we ought to celebrate this. And the West also wants to paint it this way because it can then give this impression that, it was the liberal Democrats who came in and defeated an aberration, which is fascism, right? Because Hitler and Mussolini and all these fascists and Nazis were an aberration. They were just evil people out there, and we came in and defeated them is really the line. Whereas actually historical truth reveals that the fascist and Nazi movements were a product of the failure of capitalism at that time. They were a product of capitalist forces, capitalist political parties actively bringing the fascist forces in to suppress, to crush the left. We of course know about Gramsci, who was jailed, with the prosecutor saying that his brain should not be exposed for decades. We know the communists who fought in Spain, but also throughout all these, much before fascism, and of course, like I talked about in China, where the World War began much before its official date in 1939, in the early 30s itself, with the Japanese invasion. So this part of the story, I think it's very essential to keep telling that part of the story, also because the fact that it has intense resonance today. The fact that, like Roger was talking about, we are seeing a moment where neo-fascist forces are coming in because of the tiredness, the failure of traditional centrist and even center-left parties. They can't offer an alternative, and sometimes they kind of try to pop up and say that, hey, we're better than them, which is what Mark Carney in Canada or Anthony Albanese in Australia are doing right now, saying, hey, we are not them. But in reality, their policies are what has given rise to these right-wing forces, these fascist forces we're seeing today in many parts of the world. So I think it's essential to remember that struggle against fascism is essentially a struggle against capitalism. It's a struggle against imperialism. And this battle was fought by the people across the world. It was fought on the streets. There was a battle of ideas. It was fought on the streets. It was fought with a lot of blood and loss. And that battle in many ways continues today. So I think it's important because we began this episode talking about wars and conflicts, which kind of almost seem sort of hopeless, right? Because they've continued for so long. What is the end? It's an impasse. What is the end? There's no answer. So I think it's important we kind of remember the victory that the people won in this battle against capitalism and against imperialism and against colonialism, which is really what blew apart the fascist and Nazi establishments in Germany and Italy and all their allies.
Thank you so much, Prasanth. That gives us, it's a good reminder that, such a massive beast like the fascist governments in Europe and of the world were able to be defeated through people's resistance and struggle. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to another episode of Give the People What They Want. Please follow peoplesdispatch.org and Morningstar News as well. We'll be back with you next week with more developments.